How many of you guys have been to, I said this wrong, man, they raked me over the coals in the first hour. Any of you ever been to Chunky Cheese? All right, what is it again? That's what I said, right? Chunky Cheese. Well, you know what I mean, right? You guys did exactly what they did. I thought it was Chunky Cheese. Anyway, you guys ever been there? My youngest daughter was in town with her two, and then Lindsay with her three, and it was rainy. It was a Friday, I think, something. And so Kath and I, we just said, let's take them all to whatever that restaurant is, and we'll just play and eat pizza. And Kath found out that you can buy this card, right? And if you have the card, you can play as many games as you want to play within an hour. All right, just depends on how fast you move. Well, somehow my son-in-laws, Lincoln and Kent, decided that the Lord had laid upon their heart that they were going to get enough tickets to get one of those stuffed animals that's at the top shelf, you know, at the reward place. You ever go to the reward place and they got these stuffed animals and they got these big, giant, what looks like crayons and must be candy in them or something. And maybe some board games. I mean, they're way up on the top shelf. It's almost like God's up there, you know. And then you go down to the next rung and the next rung, and then you get these cheapo things, right? Well, my son-in-laws are running. Oh, they're throwing kids out of their way so they can get to the... And they're getting these tickets all over the place. And I think they had, you know, over 1,000 tickets. And you're thinking, oh, I can just see one of those stuffed animals. Shoot. Have you ever gone to get a reward at that restaurant? We walked away with 4 little bitty plastic soldiers, 5 little, what we used to call Super Balls, but they're not the size that they were when I was young. They're about 1/10 of the size of a normal Super Ball. And one walked away with a plastic circular sheriff's badge, didn't even have a pin on the back, just had a plastic hook that you hung on your shirt. And you just, I mean, it's junk, man. It's nothing but junk. Are you kidding me? I mean, they probably threw it out the window on the way home. You know, I bet you all my grandkids don't know where any of those toys are right now. I mean, their history, they've forgotten all about it. I think about that, and I compare it to my journey with Christ. I'm so glad that I don't need so many tickets to win my salvation. Amen? I'm glad I don't have to jump through the hoops, right? Second is, even though my salvation is free, there's absolutely nothing cheap about it. It's just that somebody else paid the price. In fact, it was extremely costly. Third thing I think of when I think of that experience is every now and then I'll see somebody, a Christ follower, who's way further down the road than I am. He or she is up there on that top shelf. And I look up there and say, I want to be like him. I want to be like that guy who's impacting his world for the kingdom. Everything about him is appealing, his balance in life and the fruitfulness of his life. And I look and say, I want to be like him. But to get there, to get to that level of effectiveness in your Christ, in your Christ following, it costs more than you think. It costs more than you think. It'll cost you everything to get to that level of effectiveness and maturity and balance in your Christ following. Are you with me this morning? In this passage, in this series that we've been dealing with, we've looked at a rich young ruler who wanted to follow, but the price was too high. And then Jesus pulls his disciples aside and he talks about going to Jerusalem. And they know that if he goes to Jerusalem, some really bad things are in store. It must be that their society, their culture that they were in must have been very similar to ours. They knew just by what was happening at that moment, at that time in Jerusalem, that Jesus goes there, bad things are going to unfold. And so Jesus takes them aside and says, boys, this is what's going to happen. And he starts describing the events. Now, he's talking to guys who've left everything. He's talking to guys that already made that decision. They've walked away from everything to follow him. And let's jump back to verse 33. As he's going down the list of what's going to happen, he says in verse 33, "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests." We talked about this last week. "To the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles." Now we move into verse 34. And there's still a list. He's still going down the list. "Who will mock him, spit on him, flog him." And then next week we're going to talk about "and kill him, and 3 days later he will" what? Rise again. In verse 34, what does it mean to follow Jesus? If these things, we're talking about mocking, spitting, and flogging, if that's what he is going through and we are following him, doesn't it figure that there could be a day when, as we are modeling our life after him, that we will go through those things? Write this down. Following Jesus sometimes means being disrespected. Write that down. Sometimes following Jesus means being disrespected. I did a word study on that word mock. The Greek for it, if I can, I can't even pronounce chunky cheese. I don't even know why I'm trying this Greek stuff. Empaizo means to be jeered at, derided, ridiculed, or the really key word I focus on is the word insult. How many of you have ever been insulted? You know, they say that whatever you do, whether it's, maybe it's a game you're playing or a speech you're making or some kind of report, and you can hear the applause of 100 people in your ears. But if one person finds criticism, that's what you walk home with. Isn't that true? Haven't you learned that from experience? You could have 10, 15 people. "Oh, that was wonderful. Oh, beautiful, beautiful." And one guy comes up, "You really could have done this better." That's what you think about the rest of the night. Man, how come I didn't do that better? Are you with me? Back home, I've got this stack of books that I'm wanting to get through, and one book I've gone about halfway through is this sounds really, I don't mean to say this in any, it's a history thing on England. I don't even know why I'm doing it. I just love history. And right beside it is a thing on Churchill. I love reading biographies about great leaders. Churchill had a lady when he was prime minister during World War II in 1940s, had a lady actually hated his guts. And she was a member of parliament. And even in a parliamentary session, in front of everybody, she gets up and she says, "Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I'd poison your tea." Says that in front of everybody. And Churchill was pretty sharp, He jumped up. You know what he said? He said, "Madam, if I was your husband, I'd drink that tea." They encountered each other in a hallway, and I don't know what Churchill was doing the night before, but he was a little tipsy. And she stops and she said, "Mr. Churchill, you are disgustingly drunk." And even when he was a little inebriated, he had a sharp mind. He comes right back and says, "Madam, you are disgustingly ugly, and tomorrow morning I'll be sober." You don't want to mess with this guy, you know what I mean? Jeez, give me a break. Brother. If you're going to get in the game, which is not an option if you're a Christ follower, you're going to be insulted. There'll be times you'll be disrespected. One of my mentors from a distance, half you guys don't even know who he was, but his name was Billy Graham. He was the leading evangelist of the 20th century and the early 21st century. When he was a kid preacher, there used to be in the early days what they call Youth for Christ rallies, and they were massive. And man, the Spirit was really moving, and Billy was the leading evangelist of that movement. And in one of those rallies, there's this kid in the back. He was handing out music books as people would come in. And man, he watched every move that Billy made. And Billy was just on fire. Man, he'd preach. He was a lot more demonstrative in his early days than he was. You guys remember him as this 60, 70-year-old preacher who would just stand in one place. But when he was young, he'd run all over the place, point his finger at you, you know. And at the end of the service, a bunch of preachers, pastors, pulled him aside and raked him over the coals. You know, how he's preaching and how he was dressed and pointing that finger. And he walked away with his tail between his legs. He went home a whipped pup. But that night, in that service that he was so ridiculed in, that kid with the music books got saved that night. Came forward. Most of you, probably 98% of you, would not know this guy. His name was Warren Wiersbe. And he went on to pastor the largest church, one of the largest churches in the history of our country. He taught in 5 different seminaries. He wrote over 100 best-selling books. And he spoke in some of the largest, most impacting Bible conferences in the world. He got saved that night. What if following Christ meant being disrespected? Last week I went out on some thin ice on some of this hot, touchy issues that we have in our culture. I might do that one more time here. There was a conference in D.C. It wasn't for everybody. It was invitation only. It was only for very, very good educators, some of the best educators in the country. And believe it or not, it wasn't a Christian conference. I think it was sponsored by the government. And one of the guys that got invited was 350 educators, and one of them was one of our guys in our denomination. Sharp guy, teacher in some of our, we have about 4 different colleges and universities. And he was very much a part of it. He got invited. And it was a really good conference, and they talked about a lot of very good things and a lot of good discussion. It was well attended and well worth attending. But at the very end, the person who was the host of the conference got up in front of these 350 educators, and he said something like this. This is how they were ending the conference. Would all those present here at this conference who in a spirit of acceptance and reconciliation, who favor full acceptance of practicing homosexuality as an acceptable lifestyle into all areas of our society, and would favor unhindered access to the public classroom in our country, and who will oppose the bigoted views of homophobic fanatics, all those here present who feel that way, would you please stand? 349 educators stood and gave a 3-minute standing ovation. One boy stayed down. Guess who that was? Now listen to me. This is important to me. Don't leave right now. He's not saying that someone who has those tendencies are some kind of child molesting rapists or evil. He's not saying that they don't even have a right to that lifestyle if they want it. He's definitely not saying that they can't be very good teachers and shouldn't be teaching in the classroom. Not saying any of that. You know what kept him in the seat? Just one phrase, really. Just one phrase kept him in the seat. You know what it was? An acceptable lifestyle. If you profess to this book and are all the way a Christ follower, how do you stand for that? How do you have one foot in one kingdom and one foot in another? That's the only thing. He's not calling him an evil, wicked person. He's not even saying you shouldn't be a teacher. He just can't stand to that one thing. Can you imagine what that guy faced at the end of that thing? If you were sitting in that conference, what would you do? What if being a Christ follower meant being embarrassed? Would that be okay with you? Because God grades on the cross, not on the curve. I hope we're okay. Write this down. Following Christ not only means sometimes being disrespected, but we're going to take it one step further here, in that sometimes it means being disgraced. And Jesus speaks about this spittle, that he'll be spat upon, which in Bible days and in these days is probably the ultimate insult. But in the Old Testament days, it took it beyond that. It actually was a legal defilement. If you were spat upon in the Old Testament, you were considered to be defiled, and you had to live outside the camp for a whole week before you could come back in and be ceremonially clean. So it's one step beyond. It's one step beyond being insulted. It would mean it tends to violation. It tends to trespass. It tends to infringement. Okay, it's not just receiving ridicule. It's one step beyond it, like violation. Think in your mind of a professor who it's kind of his mission in life to destroy young Christians' faith, pull them out of the fairy tale world of their Christian walk and get them into reality. And if you remember the account, in one of his lectures, it's the same every year. In one of his lectures, he gets up and he challenges the kids to a debate, and he says, essentially, if you remember the account, he says, has anybody here ever seen God? And he waits, and of course nobody's going to raise their hand. And he says, has anybody here ever heard God? And nobody raises his hand. If you remember the account, he says, has anybody here touched God? And nobody stands. And so finally his train of thought, he says, then if you're telling me you haven't seen God and you haven't heard God and you haven't touched God, then my answer to you is there is no God. Does anybody want to refute me on that? Of course, every year, everybody's just sitting there like, who's going to stand to this guy? He's in his element. It's his classroom. Well, one year, lo and behold, if you remember the account, some kid raised his hand. Can you believe it? He dropped his jaw. A kid raised his hand, and he called on him, and he said, you have something to say? And if you remember, he asked permission. He said, well, Prof, could I ask the class a couple of questions? And he said, well, fine. And so he stands up, he turns to the class. This kid's got a backbone. And he turns to them and he says, I would like to ask, has anybody here ever seen Prof's brain? And they're saying, what? And has anybody here ever touched Prof's brain? And everybody's just kind of in shock. And then he said, has anybody heard Prof's brain? And no one's making a move. You could hear a pin drop. And finally he says, well, according to Prof's analogy or deduction, if you haven't seen his brain, heard his brain, or touched his brain, then I'm here to tell you, Prof doesn't have a brain. And everybody explodes into laughter, The whole room erupts. Guess who flunked that class? What if that's what following Christ means? I know of a young professional. She was, if I can get this word out, anesthesiologist. Is that the gal who puts you to sleep before you? Yeah. And she had moved to New Orleans. She's just out of school, and she's ready to start her practice. She's a strong Christian. And right up front, she notifies all the hospitals that she's not available for any abortion work, that it's elective, it's non-emergency procedure, and she's just not available for it. Couldn't believe the ridicule that she got for that. Was passed over for many promotions because of that position, that stand. What if following Christ meant that your professional career was hindered? In our backyard, just over in Vienna, Virginia, a few years back, there was a couple churches got together. It was Christmas, about a week before Christmas, and they got their choirs together on the City Hall steps outside, and they were doing some caroling. They sang "O Little Town of Bethlehem" and "O Come All Ye Faithful," and some of the Christmas classics. And some of the town managers and council heard about it, called the cops, and had them removed. And moved them behind a barrier off to the side on the sidewalk or away from the steps because, separation church and state. Now, it would have been just fine if they would have sung Frosty the Snowman. It would have been just fine if they had sung Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, but don't even think about singing Silent Night. What if, and this might sound a little ludicrous, but it might not be as far away as you think. What if being a Christ follower meant being arrested? That is a part of the world of many Christians outside of our territory. What if it meant taking a professional hit? What if it meant flunking a class? Because Christ grades on the cross, not on the curb. And I just feel the sunshine all over the place in this room. What if following Christ means being disrespected? What if it means being disgraced? And we can even take it one step further, or the Lord takes it one step further. What if following Christ means being disabled? What if following Christ doesn't just mean insult? What if it doesn't just mean infringement? What if it means injury? When he talks about flogging, the Greek word there for flogging is paragello. It means to scourge. It means those whips with the cattails, and at the end of the leather strips were pieces of bone or pieces of metal, so that when somebody would take the whip across your back, the metal would embed in your back, and he'd pull it, and that would rip the skin off. So now we've gone from insult, from infringement, to injury, from actually being wounded. What if following Christ meant being wounded? One of the guys I've read after is Patton. And most of you have seen his movie, and that big famous speech he makes at the beginning of it, and says, the object of this thing is not to die for your country and make the other guy die for his. But in reality, when he would be teaching on battlefield strategies, he would say the goal of a battle is not to kill your enemy, it's to wound him. You know why? Because on average, it takes 3 other soldiers to remove a wounded soldier from the battlefield. So if you kill a soldier, you've removed 1 person from the battlefield. But if you wound him, you actually remove 4 soldiers from the battlefield. So the real goal is to wound. You carry that analogy into our battle. The enemy doesn't have permission to wipe us out, but he definitely has permission to wound us. And in that wounding, what if all our resources and all that we have to bear would have to be taken up, taking care of our wounded, so that we have not enough resources to take the gospel to dark places or to address poverty or to address injustice, because of all our resources are taking care of the wounded in our own house. You ever hear the term hurting people hurt people? I've used that a ton of times. Hurting people hurt people. And if you get in the game, which you have to do if you're a Christ follower, that means you're going to get hurt. If you're going to minister to hurting people, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get wounded. I've often used the word wounded healers. What if that was part of following Christ? Would that be okay with you? You know, when you've been a pastor or maybe a coach or something like that, you come to appreciate people who play hurt. They're wounded, but they stay in the game. How many of you know this guy? Most of you, even if you're not a fan, you would know this guy as soon as he comes up. There he is. How many of you know his name? Most would say the greatest player of all time. I know that's debated, but ton of people, ton of basketball fanatics would say the best of all time. Whether you say that or not, are you enough of a fan to know, one guy knew this in the first hour, the greatest game he ever played? I think I heard it. The flu game. June 11th, 1997, Salt Lake City, the Delta Center, Chicago Bulls playing the Utah Jazz. It's the final series. It's 2-2, and they're about to play the critical 5th game. Whoever wins the 5th game in a 2-2 split will probably win the series, best of 6. The night before that critical game, Jordan is laying in bed. He's got about 5 blankets wrapped around him. He's shaking like a leaf. The thermostat is turned all the way up. They bring the team doctor in. He's got a fever of 102. He's sweating profusely. They hook him up with IVs to get fluid in him. They prescribe some medicine. They commit him to bed rest. He can't practice that morning. The word gets out that it's flu, or maybe possibly some say it was food poisoning from pizza he ate. But whatever it is, he's deathly sick. And the commentators and the sports journalists are getting it out that Michael's not going to play. Michael's not going to play. He's history for the 5th game, except for one journalist who is an ex-athlete who was one of Jordan's teammates in North Carolina, James Worthy. James was the only one who said, Jordan will find a way to play. He'll find a way. He'll conserve his strength. He said, not only will he play, but he will have a great game. When Jordan showed up in the locker room, he was white as a ghost. His eyes that normally flashed with energy were like doll's eyes. When the game started, he was weak and it looked like he was out of place, and Utah ran up a 16-point lead in the first quarter. When the play stopped, he would slump down on his hands and knees, like you see in one of the pictures. When he would go to the bench, he would collapse on the chair with his head back and ice pack on his head, and they would pour Gatorade down his throat. But somehow, some way, he found his stride, and in the second quarter, he exploded for 17 points. By the end of the game, he had scored 38 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, 3 steals, 1 block, and a 3-pointer with seconds left to win the game. 90-88. He played hurt. What if following Christ meant playing hurt? The first crisis that we faced as a church was about 3 years in to my tenure. We came in 89, August of 89, the first Sunday of 89. We had 64 people that day. Four Sundays later, we had 264 people. 4 Sundays later. By the end of that year, we were averaging 200. By the end of the next year, we were averaging 300. I mean, we were busting. We were exploding. People were coming out of the woodwork. And I was just waiting for the hammer to hit because we were changing everything. I mean, we were running to keep up with the change. And I kept my eyes on the older people because usually they're the ones that struggle with change, right? They were the ones leading the charge. They were the ones so pumped, so excited. They were way out of front of everybody else. You know where the hit came from? Your age, young adult age. There were 2 families, young adults, who grew up in that church. And they were the only young adults in that church for years. Their kids were the only children of the church for all those years. And now, all of a sudden, they wake up, and there's about 15 to 20 young adults. And now there's about 40 or 50 kids. And one Sunday they wake up, and not sure how they feel about that. And they had a run-in with one of my assistants who was over the Sunday school. She probably didn't handle it the best she could. But there was this headbutt, and out they go. And I'm sitting there going, and that's bad enough. But all those young adults that left, their parents are on my board. Their parents are the backbone of the church. It's bad to lose them, but if I lose their parents, it's over. I'm done. And so I'm standing there watching, a couple of their parents, and one parent, the father of one of the sons, when the son walks out, he watches him walk out, and he says, "Well, that boy's dumb enough to leave this church. Let him go." Some of you probably know who that guy was. Another couple, they teetered for a while, but they stayed on our side of the fence. And then a third couple, they left for about a Sunday or two, probably just to make sure that their kids found a church, but then they came back. What was interesting is the young couples that left, they didn't leave to go to a church that was small like we used to be. Both of them went to different churches. Both churches were the kind of churches we were becoming. Vibrant and growing. They loved the excitement of a growing church. They just couldn't handle it in their own backyard. And so, man, we were wounded. I'm jaws gaping. The jaws of those parents and grandparents are gaping. And basically, when they decide not to follow their kids, but to stay here, I mean, these guys, they were up to their necks in leadership. They were giving all their time. They were going way beyond their tithe to make it all happen. Basically, to build this church for the kids and grandkids that just walked out the door. Well, that wasn't in their playbook. They weren't planning on that. And it could have ended right there. I'm telling you, it could have ended right there. But basically, you know what they settled on? Those critical parents and grandparents of those kids? They said, well, if we can't build this church for our kids and our grandkids, we'll build this church for somebody else's grandkids. Do you know who those grandkids are? You. They stayed in the game. They played hurt to build this church for your kids and for you. I'm here to tell you, as sure as I know my name, if those three families would have followed their kids out, none of us would be in this room. We wouldn't own this mountain, and I don't know where Parkway would have been. We are building this thing on the shoulders of a generation who played hurt. They're on the top shelf. They're the ones I look and say, I want to be like them. The only thing is it costs more than you think to get up there. It costs everything you have. So I tell you what we're going to do. I've already asked permission to this. They've already gone around this once. This is the first time they've been in church for 2 hours in probably about 20 years. But I've asked them to come back, and I think they're all still here. Is Walter Bowling still here? Where's he at? Walter. Somebody escort Walter up. Somebody escort Ira and Joanne. They're right back there. Somebody escort, there's Tommy and Joyce. They're right over there. Somebody escort them up. And where's Dick and Sue? I saw Dick and Sue. There they are. You're still in the shadows, just where you were last. Someone escort Dick and Sue. Would you guys help me honor this generation of churchmen who stood in the gap for us? That's right. We want to say thank you to this generation who played hurt. Walter is 92 years old. I don't even know if he can hear me from the back. He was the first pastoral care pastor. He was a volunteer. He used to sit on the platform with me. We used to start the service with reading a scripture, and Walter would read that scripture. I buried his wife, dear Helen, has been in heaven for about 1.5 to 2 years. But he has been a giant in our church. Love you, Walter. Ira was the vice chair. He was the guy who called me in Marion, Indiana, to see if I would come to some place called Roanoke, Virginia. He's the guy who met me at the airport. He drove me all around Roanoke. Don't listen to a word that he wants to say right now because none of it's true. He was vice chairman through those critical beginning years. He was always right there, always right beside me. And finally, we adopted this thing where, you had this rotating thing where we give other people a chance to be on the board. And so he rotated off. I never was able to get him back on. But nobody was a vice chairman like Ira Hartman. Tommy Gibson was on my first board and has been a trustee and a board member through the years. His wife, Joyce, I still do that after 30 years. I mess these guys up. Joyce and Joanne were our first preschool teachers. We started, the midday preschool? These were the very first teachers. They started it. They weren't even paid. They did it volunteer. And now we have over 70 children in a vibrant, growing preschool that they started. All the way over Dick and Sue. Dick I asked him in the first hour how long he's been teaching. He doesn't even know. He was our lay leader. I made him our lay leader the very first week I was there. He used to teach on Wednesday nights and has taught on Sunday mornings for as far back as, I don't know if Jesus was around or not, but he is still in the works. He is still teaching. He has one of the best teachers to this day, and Sue has been right there beside him. I want you to help me give a round of applause to these guys. Now this is what I want to do. If you are here and could say, you know what it is to play hurt. You know what it is to be a wounded healer. Then I would invite you to slip in and stand around one of these couples. Put a hand on a shoulder, and we're going to pray over them here in just a minute. But I want them to be surrounded by this generation of Parkway people. So I'm going to ask you to come. Wherever you are, if you're even in the balcony, if you would be willing to come and just stand behind or beside one of these pillars of our faith, we're going to pray over them. Maybe if you're still in your chair, you could maybe just extend your hand this direction. Would that be okay? Just extend your hand this way. Lord Jesus, I want to thank you for Parkway's heritage. I want to thank you for the good stuff that we come from, the foundation that was laid back there in the early days when they were still at the old Fallon Park Church, and the church was down, I think Ira said, around 40 people, maybe a little lower than that. But they always felt like they could be more than who they were. And some have actually described it as they were just sick of being sick. They just wanted to be something more. And through the leadership prior to me, they relocate to 9 acres over on King Street and take a huge step of faith to build a brand new church, and then to call a rookie like me, who's never been a senior pastor, and invited me to come and lead them, and to see all the growth and all the change, and to hang in there through all the change. And not that they agreed with all of it. I know they didn't agree with all of it. But they didn't take their toys and go home. They stuck in, and they rolled up their sleeves. And to this day, their sleeves are still rolled up. And they're still, in many ways, in their heart, leading the charge. And so I pray for Walter in these lonely days. I know these are lonely days without Helen. And I pray you'll comfort him and reassure him that not only his blood family is with him, but his spiritual family is with him and surrounds him. And Ira and Joanne, and the stroke that Ira's trying to fight back from, and Joanne trying to help him. Strengthen them and continue to touch Ira and heal him in Jesus' name. Father, I pray for Tommy and Joyce. Both of them are battling cancer, different cancers within each one of them, but they're battling, and you have already blessed in so many ways that we're glad that Joyce is still here, and that she has wonderful quality of life. And we hope that you keep them here till Jesus comes. But I do want these last years to be good years and good fellowship years. And Dick and Sue, still teaching, still swinging the bat, still in the game. They haven't quit yet. They just built a new home, downsized and getting ready for retirement. Already been in retirement, but making adjustments. And I just pray that you'll be with them in this relocation and continue to help him to divide the word week in and week out. Father, thank you for these churchmen, for they represent a whole generation. Some of them are already in heaven. Some of them are in nursing homes. Some come to Sunday school, but they can't stay for 2 services. But if it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for these wounded healers, these guys who knew how to play hurt, we wouldn't be here. We're building on their foundation. And so I pray for them that they will enjoy watching their church soar and to see how God used the sacrifices of their day to impact so many lives. We've had 112 decisions for Christ just this year. We've had almost 30 baptisms. All of that just this year. All that's made possible because they played hurt back there. So Father, I want right now to be the pat on the back where they can hear from their church, at least their church, well done. Thank you. Thank you for standing in the gap for our kids. We commit them into your care in Jesus' name. And all God's people said. Give them a good round of applause as they return back to their seats.
Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Lord.